Industrial Strategy Select Committee for our hearing today on levelling up and the delivery of regional growth. And we're grateful this morning to have four busy, in-demand witnesses before the committee. Andy Burnham, Metro Mayor for Greater Manchester, Steve Rotheram, the equivalent Metro Mayor for the Liverpool City region, Tim Bowles from the west of England, and Jamie Driscoll for the north of Tyne Combined Authority. Welcome and good morning to all of you. Today we're going to split the session into an opening question of the impact of COVID on your regional economies and the functioning of the combined authorities, and then dive into some of the detail about how it's been going since you've been elected and what lessons might need to be learnt for delivering the levelling up agenda and the industrial strategy in the years to come. Before we get going, I should probably declare an interest that I was the Southwest Regional Coordinator for the Andy Burnham for Labour Leader campaign, although as Steve Rotheram just called it, the failed Andy Burnham for Leader campaign. And I think in that context, I'm pretty sure Steve once paid for my curry, so I should probably declare that as well too. Are there any other declarations of interest from colleagues before we get going? No, excellent. Okay, well, look, let's open with the first question, which is obviously extremely topical, which is the impact of COVID on your regional economies and what that has shown in terms of the relationship between Westminster and regional leadership. And in the order that I called you just now, I'll come to you, Andy Burnham, first.
Well, good morning, Chair. Good morning to members of the committee. I remember that curry very well, but I guess we probably shouldn't go into that on this call. But as I was saying, it wasn't the raw materials that were the fault in that leadership campaign. It was the organisation behind it, wasn't it, Mr. Rotheram, that was the problem. And anyway, all in the past. But thank you for holding this session today. I think it's a really important session. And in terms of the impact on our economies, it's severe, I think, is the only way to put that. It's on people more broadly. You know, I think over the course of this year, it's got harder and harder as the reality of living with COVID has sunk in. Here we've been in Tier 2 restrictions since late July, and obviously that has had an effect on our people in terms of their lives and their morale, their mental health, but also has eroded the strength of our businesses, because obviously the effect of Tier 2 restrictions is to keep people at home, reduce footfall, and I think that's something that we've now perhaps experienced more than other places. In terms of the relationship, Chair, then I think I may as well get to it, hadn't I? You know, what's happened this week. And I think maybe, you know, if we all sort of think about it positively, perhaps this is a moment where England sort of grows up a little, really, around devolution and the relationship between Westminster and the rest of the country. The culture is still that Westminster holds all the power and all the money. And you know, the mayors on this call have to go on bended knee, really, and we have to plead at times for some of that money. And I think that's where this is still wrong. We've kind of got devolution in name, but not in reality yet. And England needs to decide, does it want devolution in reality? Because otherwise, if Westminster carries on holding all the power, levelling up will be a slogan rather than a thing that really happens, because you can't level up from Whitehall. You can't just drop projects on places and call that levelling up. And I suppose, you know, for me, the lesson of this week, Chair, is a kind of the reason why this became a fundamental issue for me in the negotiation we've just had is that, you know, Steve and I could tell you when we were in Westminster, we were used to seeing the north of England get pushed around and told no. You know, that was just basically what happened. But things in some ways came to a head because of this simple point. If you are going to lock down people's jobs, if you are going to lock down people's lives, and you're going to do that to some places but not other places, you can't do that on terms dictated from 200 miles away. And I think for me, that is the point about this week. If you are going to do that, it clearly has to be on the terms of people here, in terms of what will help us to cope with what is a massive change that you're asking us to make. But essentially, that's what it was, that we were being asked to lock down on terms dictated from very far away. And ultimately, that was a point of principle that needed to be made, and a stand was needed to be taken.
Thank you for that. And Steve, coming to you next, the impact of COVID on the Liverpool City region and the functioning of the combined authority.
Thanks, Chair. And as you can imagine, very similar sort of story to what's happening in Greater Manchester. But COVID, I think, exposed a number of fault lines that were already there in the system, but had been prevalent for far too long, and then had really started to hold areas in the north back. And we had much worse outcomes, for instance, in education and skills and health, huge disadvantages to our particular region. And I believe our economy suffered because of that, and because of those interventions from central governments that could have helped us to address the whole levelling up agenda. So we over the last few weeks, like Andy and others, we want to work to really close that disparity that there is between the north and the south. And I'll give you a couple of examples, Chair. We entered the pandemic with around 70,000 people unable to work due to ill health. And of course, that's only got worse. And we have a high prevalence of long-term conditions in the Liverpool City region, and a disproportionately high number of deaths that have happened over the last 7 or 8 months also will increase pressures on, for instance, mental health and well-being, and the impact of that may not be immediate, but we will see that increasing over the months ahead. And according to a recently published, if we're talking about levelling up, the recently published Levelling Up Index by WPI Strategy said that Liverpool Walton, which I used to represent and is now represented by Dan Carden, is one of the 10 constituencies most in need of levelling up. And we have 4 of the LCR constituencies in the top 10. In other words, something needs to happen. We need meaningful economic progress, because without that, we won't address the underlying social, educational and health disadvantages in our area. And Andy Burnham mentioned about being in Parliament. It was when I was in Parliament that I truly understood what the Westminster bubble really is, and the fact that for far too long, too many decisions have been taken with the interests of London, I have to say, but the London centricity, and I don't not just mean the area of London, I'm talking about with the overall London culture that exists within Parliament, and that has been hugely disadvantageous to areas like ours. So we know it's not a perfect system. We want to work to try and see whether we can level up. We stand as Metro Mayors ready to do that, but the government needs to work seriously and meaningfully with us.
Thank you for that. And Tim Bowles, coming to you. In our neck of the woods, we've obviously not had the same tier issues around COVID, but nonetheless it's affected the economy. So how has COVID impacted the West of England and the functioning of the combined authority?
Chair, well, thank you very much. And sorry, when you were talking about interests, I did reflect and think, I think we've probably both bought one another a coffee at some point. So I think we forgot to declare those. But thank you for that. And thank you for couching it in that way. Now, I work really closely with all of the Metro Mayors. We are really, really closely aligned. Steve knows, however, though, that I will always challenge him when he talks about North versus South. So to pick your, and I'll come back to that in a second, but to pick your point up, Chair, yes, the nature of our economy, which is different as all regions are, and that's why combined authorities are important, because they are able to identify their regional strengths and weaknesses. We are being affected. We know that. We have the evidence to prove that. We are working on a daily basis with our teams here about how it's impacting whether it's businesses like Airbus, whether it's our creative sector, or all those brilliant small SMEs that we have across the region. So we've got the evidence behind that. We understand, because of that interaction with them, the impact on those different types of businesses, those different scales of business. So there is an impact there, and that impact will be similar in principle to the rest of the country. Clearly, as a regional mayor, we have the ability to focus on what we need to do here. So we're seeing that. However, now I work really closely. I've got a panel of all of the business subscription groups along with all of the banks, because that way we see it as a way in which we can approach, share information with every business in our region. There is still a positive view in an awful lot of businesses about how we move out of this and move forward. But clearly the current additional lockdown potential is going to have an impact on that. So we're working really closely. We understand exactly what's happening in the region. We recognise where our opportunities are in the future. But if I may then to go back to the levelling up piece, the really important piece for me today was to really share with members the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, and I think all of the Metro mayors are, this shouldn't be about north-south, because I will give you the statistics that, in spite of being a very, very successful region, I can talk to you about those areas that are chronically in need of investment, where we have some areas of real deprivation across all of our councils. So we have a really compelling case about that investment level. And traditionally, we have not been receiving the same levels of investment here in the west of England as people have seen in London and the southeast. And if I may, to my friends here, even in some instances around the levels of investment we've seen here compared to in the north. So levelling up is vital for us. It's vital in the way that government needs to now start backing mayors and combined authorities to overcome at the moment those hurdles that are preventing us moving this forward and really owning our recoveries. We'll all talk at length happily about Green Book and financing and the tools we need and all of those things behind it, because whenever we meet as the Metro mayors, we're always tightly aligned in that. So we have a really, really clear understanding of what our region is doing at the moment. We have a clear understanding on where we need to be able to invest in research, in skills, in terms of reaching out to young people across all of our communities. We're doing all of that work. We now need the support from government to deliver. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Tim. And Jamie, last but not least, the impact of COVID on the north of Tyne economy and the functioning of the combined authority, please.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you to all the members for inviting me to speak. The impact of COVID has come on top of what wasn't a particularly prosperous region in the first place. So we've seen unemployment in a population of around 880,000 increase by around 18,000. No, actually, we've seen the claimant count increase by 18,000. That doesn't take into account those who have lost their jobs, but perhaps whose partner is working and they aren't eligible. So that is really quite significant, and that's before the furlough scheme has ended. I've been speaking to so many businesses. I speak to the CBI, the Chamber of Commerce. We have a very strong Chamber of Commerce, work closely together, the Federations for Small Businesses. And the headlines have been grabbed by pubs having to close, the hospitality sector. But this is affecting so many businesses. Taking my kids to the dentist the other day, she was telling me that their income has dropped by 45% since March. So, you know, the whole economy in terms of SMEs has run out of reserves. That is the big problem. So it's not the case that they can't trade. It's the case that the amount of money coming in has made everybody quite vulnerable. And I really fear a domino effect. That's going to have an effect on young people, their opportunity. And as we know, if people are out of work for a couple of years, especially in the early stage of their lives, it can affect them for a long period of time. Yesterday was the 215th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar. And it's worth noting that Nelson had his plan, but he also knows that no plan survives contact with the enemy. So he got all of his captains together the night before the battle, and he said, no captain can do much wrong if he puts his ship alongside that of the enemy. Now, if 215 years ago, Nelson understood the value of distributed leadership, All of our modern corporations understand distributed leadership. Our best public services let the professionals at the coalface make the decisions, and all modern militaries do it. Then surely a modern democracy should be distributing command to the people who are close to the decisions, close to the information. An example of what we've managed to do, we started this as soon as lockdown happened. I got my senior team together and we looked and we saw how much money do we have available. Very, very little compared to the government. We had £5 million, a propitious figure in recent days. But that £5 million, we immediately got a whole series of interventions. For example, there's a business in central Newcastle. It's an old office block that's not in use. It's waiting there, land banked. When I was a city councillor, the council made sure that if the landlord reduced the rents, they would reduce the business rates. There's now over 600 small businesses operating out of there, from people who help elderly people plan holidays for accessibility to fashion designers, the lot. All of those people fell through the gap in the support scheme. So we were able to put the money in to keep those premises available so that they could continue their businesses. But the other things we've done is been able with digital exclusion. So to put things in when kids were sent home from school, teachers trying to do lessons with them, but they might only have an iPad in the house or a tablet, and mum or dad needs it for work. So we were able to source very rapidly equipment for them and get that operational so that these kids were able to continue their education in some way. So that's the level of what you can do with tailored interventions. If we were to see, I'm not even going to talk about test and trace and how that would be so much more effective if it had a stronger local component. If we can get this kind of approach in, that is how we're going to make a difference, because the plans we've got together, as I said, we weren't in a strong place in January anyway. We already had a base level of unemployment. But we've got to accept that significant parts of the economy have changed, such as people working from home. Irrespective of viruses or anything else, that is not going to change back significantly. So we need to be creating the new jobs, and that's where the targeted interventions from regional leaders who are able to convene can really make a difference. Our CSR contribution is going to create 35,000 jobs in the Northeast, 100,000 in the wider Northeast. That's a huge rate. That will eradicate unemployment, will eradicate poverty.
Thank you, Jamie. I've got two quick supplementals, one from Judith Cummings and one from Paul Howell, and then we'll go into some of our detailed questions around combined authority performance. So, Judith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. My question's to you, Andy, and it's around the statement that the Chancellor is making today, which is expected to announce more support for businesses in Tier 2. Now, obviously, this is welcome news, hopefully, but what do you make of the fact that this is happening days after London entered Tier 2, despite the fact that places like Manchester and Bradford has been in the equivalent of Tier 2 for nearly 3 months now?
Thanks so much, Judith, and nice to see you. I want to pick up on something Tim said. You know, I know we do talk about north-south and the difference, but he makes a really important point where, you know, I want people in London who are struggling to get the same help as people here who are struggling. We're not trying to set people aside. We know this is affecting people everywhere. And we are stronger when, you know, and I'm a patriotic person, I'm proud of our capital city. I want us all to do well, but I just want everywhere to do well at the same time. And sometimes, obviously, it doesn't feel that's the way the country works. But to answer your question, I'm really struggling with this announcement today, if this is what is going to be confirmed. Not because I begrudge people working in pubs or restaurants in London the help. Of course I don't. But why now? You know, why has it taken London to go into Tier 2 for Tier 2 support to become a national issue? I mean, that's the question, isn't it? That everyone has to answer, not just the government, but the country needs to answer that. You know, why do we see why do we see London's issues much more than we see Liverpool's issues, Greater Manchester's issues? You know, that I think is a really troubling question that this committee needs to talk about as part of this. And actually, wouldn't we have had a better response to this pandemic if at the start we just devolved flexible, significant funding for the support that individuals and businesses were going to need, and that the people on this call and the combined authorities we lead and the councils within them just were given support and backing from the start to help people, rather than an eat out to help out scheme there and a kickstart somewhere else. And that's this culture that we've got, and it doesn't lead us to sort of respond properly as a country. But I honestly was just open-mouthed really when I read the headlines last night that there was going to be a support package. It was billed as being for London and Birmingham, and it was just a case of, hello, we've been under these restrictions for 3 months, and I know you're part of West Yorkshire has as well, and East Lancashire, and that just doesn't seem to have featured at all. Bolton had their pubs closed for 3 weeks with nothing, absolutely nothing, despite the fact that we did raise that on a regular basis. And then this just brings me finally to, in some ways, it makes me ask, what was this week all about then? The slightly brutal nature of the process that we were all in, that Steve was in first, and then Steve was played off against me, and we were all supposedly in individual negotiations with the government. That's how it was put to us. On Tuesday, in my final discussion with the Prime Minister, I was making the clear pitch to him that we had been in three months of restrictions, and therefore we were in a different position to the Liverpool city region, and different from Lancashire, because parts of East Lancashire have been in restrictions, but not all. And of course, we have more businesses here than they do. And that factor did not weigh at all in the final analysis. They basically said, no, you're going to get the same as the population-based figure for Lancashire and Liverpool. So I just think there are major questions for the government to answer here as to how it's treating places. It feels as though it's dividing and ruling, making one rule for one and one approach for another. And I don't think that's the way you get through a pandemic. In fact, that's the worst way to manage things in a pandemic. And I think there has to be a bit of a reckoning here now. And to be honest, coming back together, because I've not done this for people claim it was politics, people claim posturing. It was none of those things. When Steve and I left Westminster, we were fed up actually of the ways of Westminster. Sometimes, as you all know, down there it's politics before people. And what we try and do as mayors is say, no, people and the place first, before politics. And that's what I felt I was doing. A city region, 3 months in restrictions, being asked to go into deeper restrictions. I had to say, this is what I think we need to carry people through this. And obviously that argument wasn't heard, but today it is being heard for other places that have just gone in for tier 2 restrictions. So unless there is a basic even-handedness in terms of the way you've got a powerful centre that's not treating places equally, and really that is a terrible place to find ourselves in the middle of a pandemic. And I would just say to the government, there has to be a bit of a clear the air here, coming back together, and a kind of a new sort of a reset really between national and local government, and a kind of sense of fairness across the whole of England. Because without it, we really are going into into quite a dark and fairly dangerous place. So as I say, sorry, Chair, but I just needed to sort of get some of this off my chest, because I say I don't begrudge anybody in tier 2 restrictions, but why wasn't that a major factor that weighted in our favour when we were in those final discussions with the government on Tuesday? And why couldn't they then have closed a £5 million gap between what I had come down to be asking for and what they said they were offering? But as we now know, not offering because it was any more than anywhere else had got. And I just think, this all now has to be sort of the matter of a proper public debate and a kind of reset moment for the governance of England.
Thank you for that. Paul Howell, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, it's just moving the discussion into a slightly different place. It's been very, very clear over the last week, the profile of, yourselves in terms of having the discussions. And, when it comes to levelling up, I mean, I look at yourself, Andy, and I look at you as being in the south somewhere. I look after Sedgefield, and I've got this split that goes between having a mayor and not having a mayor. And that's really where the question's coming from, in the sense that, you guys are shouting for your regional areas, but obviously, if I take mine, Durham County hasn't got a mayor. So how do we make sure that when we talk about levelling up, we talk about the ability of people like yourselves to shout, what about the ones that's not quite there yet in terms of structure? I know there's things moving in the direction, but I'd be interested how do we make sure that, you might not be listened to, but what about the next level that's not even into the Metro Mayor area? Jamie, you put your hand up. Do you want to start there?
If Jamie could answer that.
Please. Yeah. Nice to meet you, Paul. Very much looking forward to working with you on this, actually. We've not had a chance to catch up yet. So the wider North East, we are at a place where we're working together. So I work very closely with your councillors, your council leader, Simon Hennick. And as the North East, we've been working together closely as an LA7, all